All right, man. What's going on?
What's up, brother?
How are
Glad to
you?
be on here,
Yeah,
man.
dude. Well, welcome, guys. If you are listening to this and you're not actually watching, welcome to another episode of Viva Nutrition Radio. I'm changing the setting here today because I'm in Ryan's house. We also call it Casa de Keto. I
That's
think
right.
I think I spent a good amount of time here in the past. But super excited to have you on, man. Like it's obvious been a pleasure, working with you in the past. Former boss, like colleagues, friends, everything. Why don't you tell people a little bit about you? Like, what's the story behind Ryan P. Lowry?
Ryan Plowry.
Ryan Plowry, as we kind of find it on
Yeah,
Instagram.
yeah, man. Well, first off, thanks for having me on, man. It's an honor, and I'm a huge fan, supporter of everything you do. And I mean, just to give a brief background, grew up playing sports, played baseball, basketball, football growing up. I was actually one of those people that you probably work with a lot in the athletic realm of like, I was a hard gainer, like was drinking weight gainer shakes. Like you couldn't believe I was eating crap. I was eating junk food because my metabolism could get away with it. But when I was in high school, my grandmother passed away at 61 years old. She was overweight, had heart disease, complications. And that was when it really struck a chord with me. I said, you know what? I can get away with this, but that's not going to last forever. And my mom has Crohn's, my aunt has MS, and like we have that history in our family, and we eat poorly. And that's always been like, hey, my grandmother used to cook. We used to say for an army, and it was only like 5 people, and we would just eat a lot of pasta, a lot of
Italian
grains,
family, right?
a lot of Italian family, man. And so that kind of really struck my path to go, you know what, I originally wanted to become a physical therapist. And I said, you know what, I want to go into this nutrition performance realm. And that's when I went down to the University of Tampa. I met Dr. Jacob Wilson, studied under him for a while. We did a bunch of research all while I was playing baseball at University of Tampa. And after I was done, I stopped playing baseball my junior year, and I was still drinking weight gainer shakes. My coach told me I was too small. I was trying everything under the sun. But the minute I stopped playing baseball, I put on 30 pounds within 6 months because I was still had the terrible eating habits, but I wasn't as active. My metabolism completely changed. And that's when we really got introduced and started looking at like, hey, what if there's this like lower carb, higher fat approach? To me, it was absurd because I was drinking probably 200 grams of carbs in a weight gainer shake a day. So the concept of eating like a low amount of carbohydrates per day was like out of the question.
Yeah.
And so that's really where the journey started and really led us down this path of doing a bunch of research and investigation.
Yeah, man, thank you for sharing that. I think that, and I've heard this story before, but I think people listening in, like a lot of the stuff that you shared, about your family, about your past, is obviously being super impactful, and to what kind of led you to become who you are today. I think I mentioned it on the introduction, but you're the founder of ketogenic.com. So keto and the low carb, we're gonna call it a trend. Some people call it a fad. I don't call it that, and I think you and I both agree on that. So of course, like this is something that is going around a lot. It's like very trendy, and you are one of the people that I look up to as far as like ketogenic research in the ketogenic space, because there's a lot of, we're just gonna call it fluff out there on some of the stuff that is being talked about on keto, and there's people going against it and stuff, and we're gonna talk about some of those details as far as like your thought process on all that, and how do you kind of, what are the biggest misconceptions that you see on it. But before we get into that, like what was kind of like, I remember you told a story one time that you went to like this presentation on like, like somebody talking about this stuff. And I think that's kind of like what got the whole process started for you guys to start researching, because here's what a lot of people don't do out there that talk about keto. They don't research this stuff,
Right.
like applied research, like in a lab, like doing this kind of stuff. And you guys are one of the few ones that have done it. So what was that like at that point? Like, when I think I remember the story, you look up at Jake and you're like, we need to do this.
Yeah, we need to do it. So honestly, man, it was Dom DiAugustino is a good friend of ours. And he was doing a lot of work on the epilepsy, military, oxygen toxicity stuff. And I remember I would look at Dom and I'm like, dude, his arms are bigger than my head. And I'm watching the guy eat sardines out of a can. And I'm like, what the heck is this keto thing? And he was doing it mainly for his research on oxygen toxicity. And in 2010, we went to the National Strength and Conditioning Association conference, and Dr. Jeff Volek was giving a talk on endurance athletes in keto. And him and Dr. Finney had been doing work Dr. Finney's been doing work since like the 1980s. And they were doing work saying basically, hey, if you're an endurance athlete and you can do a ketogenic lifestyle, if you have plenty of glycogen and you're adapted for long enough. And he was given all this great information that he had been recently studying. But at the end of the presentation, someone stood up and they were like, but what about resistance training? Like, you need insulin for muscle. Like what do you think about muscle? And Aunt Volek's like, honestly, like, we don't have anything. And that's when Jacob and I looked at each other. I was like, let's do it. Like, I'm interested in it. And that really spearheaded the first start of it. And one of the things that we always do for our research is, like, I got to put myself through it before anyone else goes through it. And this is a funny story because you'll look at this and be like, this was totally wrong. But the first time I ever did keto, I did it awful, like terribly wrong, because I have a sweet tooth, because I came from eating junk. I ate dessert for breakfast, lunch, and dinner because I could get away with it. Yeah. And so I was like, I still had that. And so I was like, literally 3 meals a day, I would have what I called my keto mousse. I didn't have anything else. I was like, oh, if I'm going to do this keto thing, I'm going to do it my way. It was heavy cream, unsweetened dark cacao, some sweetener, some coconut butter, and protein. And it's delicious. And it was this keto mousse, but like had no micronutrients in it, no vitamins, like everything. So like it went great for about 4 days, and then I felt like crap, and I was like, this keto thing sucks. Like, it's horrible. And then I started realizing, wow, actually I need to incorporate in, like, there's a difference between going keto and a well-formulated ketogenic diet. And I think that's the main thing that I know you work with a lot of people on as well. It's a big difference.
Which actually leads, and I do remember those, like, I think there's a couple times I went to UT, because obviously that's where it all, like, all the magic happened, or where it all started. And I do remember, like, those shakes, and like you guys, like, because like Dog would also do it too, like, Dr. Wilson also would do it all the time. So that's awesome. So I guess, like, you mentioned the word, like, well-formulated ketogenic diet, and I think that separates a big out of that fluff that I was talking about earlier. So can you, for people listening in, like, define what a well-formulated ketogenic diet is? And I know it has different definitions depending on the population, but just for the sakes of generalization, for people to get a basic understanding of it. I've talked about it in the past, but I just want to hear from the expert. What is some, like, how would you describe and how would you define it versus what I guess, like, what you see a lot in most people talking about what a ketogenic diet is.
Right. And the first thing to understand is there's a million ways you can do keto, right? So technically, you could be a CrossFit athlete, eat a Snickers candy bar, and be on a quote-unquote keto diet, and you're like, how is that possible? Your calories are really low. You're burning through more of that. You'll be in ketosis if that's all you ate. I'm saying you have one Snickers bar a day. You don't need anything else. Is that optimal for their performance? Is that optimal for their health? No. But technically you're in ketosis. People take things to extreme. There are people doing carnivore. I think there's a right way and a wrong way. Like, there are people who are doing it for some aspects where they're eating nose to tail. They're including organ meats, things like that. There are some people who are going to McDonald's, getting a burger without a bun for every meal. Is that optimal? Is that a well-formulated diet by any means? No, absolutely not. Yeah. There's the nutrients in that, the oils that they use for processing things. So like you said, there's people, and it's called dirty keto, lazy keto, this keto. It needs to be at most 90% of your day should come from a well-formulated ketogenic diet, meaning you're getting high-quality sources of protein. You're getting high-quality sources of fat. You're minimizing things like vegetable oils, which you should be minimizing if you're even not on a ketogenic diet. You shouldn't be most of your diet coming from all vegetable oils. Using things that are good quality fats. Using things that are good quality sources of protein. Eating high-fibrous vegetables. I've known people who have done a ketogenic diet. I've had friends who literally have gotten their macros calculated, and they say they're like, you know what, I'm going to eat 30 grams of carbohydrates per day. They literally only ate protein and fat for breakfast, for lunch, and then at night they would eat like 10 sweetest fish and be like, I'm on a ketogenic diet, like, because I have 30. It was like if it fits your macros keto, and they'd fit in their sweetest fish, and I'm like, That's not not a well-formulated ketogenic diet. So it's understanding sticking to whole foods. I think anyone would agree that's probably the ideal, but making sure you're getting in high quality source of protein, high quality source of fat, and your carbohydrates are going to be coming from lean, green vegetables, things that are high in fiber that are good quality nutrients.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest misconception that exists with many people, especially because I get a lot of sometimes dietitians that ask me this question because. Well, and I want to get your perspective on this. Ketogenic diet is nothing new, right? And this is like a lot of times like people look at it as a fad, as something like, oh, it's something trendy, but yet the keto has been around for a while. So what's kind of like the story behind it? And I know, and I've talked about this, and one of the things that resonated a lot when I was reading your book, The Ketogenic Bible, what's the story behind it? Why do people fear fats? And what's like the reasoning and the rationale behind that? And that had left us to be on a position today where that's still kind of feared. Now I feel like the ketogenic diets have kind of changed that paradigm that existed. But where did it all start?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I mean, it goes back deep, and that was actually my favorite part to write about the book because it was really interesting to dive into that. But the term ketogenic diet has been used since the 1920s. People have been doing a low carb, high fat approach since the 1800s. And so where things changed were in the 1920s, people were using a ketogenic diet for children with epilepsy. They saw that fasting, and then if you can mimic that fasting state through a ketogenic diet, it was seeing tremendous results for children with epilepsy. Then what happened is the Great Recession came around. Pharmaceutical companies, it was a lot easier to do drug studies and just give animals drugs and see that they stop their seizures than to implement a ketogenic diet and try and do that in children. So that became prevalent. Pharmaceutical drugs started getting introduced, and it was a lot easier to get someone to be compliant with a pill than it would be to get them in their nutrition regimen. And so that took precedent. And then we all know the infamous Ansel Keys conundrum with the 7-country study where he basically originally thought it was cholesterol. His original research was, I'm going to blame this on cholesterol. We started having cardiovascular disease problems. Our president at the time, Dwight Eisenhower, had a cardiovascular event, a heart attack, and they were like, wow, we need to get people to figure out what their nutrition is. No one talked about the fact that he smoked 4 packs of cigarettes a day, and that was probably the issue, but they blamed it on his diet. But he ate what would typically now be like a Western diet, like a high fat, high carb diet. But nonetheless, originally it was cholesterol, and then Ansel Keys did a study, and he actually found when you consume dietary cholesterol, it doesn't have any impact on blood cholesterol. So he's like, I need to switch it up. And he picked fat, and he's like, you know what, we're going to choose fat. And he started looking at the 7 countries. He cherry picked 7 countries that had high amounts of saturated fat intake and that correlated with high amounts of cardiovascular disease. And from there, it just stemmed forward. Everything was like, oh, it's the fat. We got to go low fat. The American guidelines came out. The food pyramid came out where our base should be grains and all these carbohydrates and very little fats and oils at the top. And it was just how we were educated. It was how we were instructed, really stemming from that quote unquote research. And it ultimately led to the position where we're at today. And I think we're starting to switch that paradigm and go, first off, it's not the fat that was really the issue. It was the combination of high amounts of fat, high amounts of carbohydrates, which unfortunately we still have today. Go to any fast food place, you're getting a burger with French fries. It's high fat, high carb. That's what the issue is. And so how do you minimize that? And that's really a ketogenic diet, one of those approaches. There's multiple ways to do it, but a ketogenic diet is one of the ways where you lower carbohydrates and still keep those healthy, high quality fats in.
That's powerful, yeah. And I've read the story and or like the history behind it, and it's really impactful because I feel like I wonder sometimes like what would it be like our current society if that didn't happen, right? If we would have actually kind of like done things a little bit different. And obviously that's maybe it wouldn't be called like ketogenic diets like today. It would be just be called like it's just a regular standard.
That'd be the standard American diet.
Standard American diet. So I think that's powerful. Now, you mentioned like different types of ketogenic diets, and the reason I ask this question is because in clinical settings, especially for us dietitians, there are clinical ketogenic diets that are implemented in a lot of people, but I feel like the breakdown of how you formulate something like this, they go from very strict to more lenient, more like, you can have a little bit more certain things. For example, when we define like a true clinical ketogenic diet, we're looking at 80 to 90% of like total calories coming from fat sources. Only like maybe like a 10%, I think it's like currently coming from proteins, and like less than 2 to 3% coming from carbohydrates, which doesn't even allow for things like either sometimes vegetables, because there's a therapeutic kind of approach that we're trying to achieve here. So what are some of the ties from like the highest to now the more, again, like flexible type of ways that you can get to as far as ketogenic diets, and can you still benefit from all of them across the board?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where a lot of the misconception comes with some of the negative side effects of a ketogenic diet is they're looking at the old studies with therapeutic modalities. Like you're saying, they were eating 90% of their calories as fat. Like if you looked at a plate, if you really like imagine having a kid try and eat 90% of their calories as fat. It literally looks like butter and lard. They're getting a little bit of chicken and like one stem of broccoli. Like it's unpalatable, but they thought that was the best way to induce ketosis, and that was the only way to do it. And at that point, it was like, is their goal really growth and development, or is it to stop their seizures and keep their life? And the thing was, it was to stop their seizures and keep their life. So you saw they were hindered in their development, they were hindered in their nutrition. That's not high quality nutrition, but that's what they needed to stop the seizures. Now we've come to realize you can be a lot more lenient, even in cases like with epilepsy. Like one of our colleagues, it's like a modified Atkins approach that he's studying with epileptic seizures, and still finding that like you can eat protein basically in children ad lib. They're not going to be like bodybuilders who are eating 200, 300 grams of protein. They eat to satiety, but they get in ample amounts of fat, and they just restrict their carbohydrates, and they're still seeing the same results in decreases in epileptic seizures. So you're absolutely right. I think originally the therapeutic aspect, like it comes down to goals and context. Like if someone has cancer and they're implementing this under the guidance of a dietitian and their physician, is their goal really to put on muscle and to have great body composition? No, it's to fight the cancer. And so sure, they might need to be at maybe like a more strict ratio or a higher amount of fat to do that. But for most people, if their goal is fat loss or just overall health and I just want to improve my body composition, you can be a lot more lenient and flexible and understand you might be able to be at 60, 65% fat. You're exercising, you're working out, eating still a low carbohydrate, high fibrous vegetables, and be more lenient with your protein than that 90%, maybe 8% protein amount.
Yeah, that's very important. And speaking of applications, or speaking of context, I guess that's like the bigger part of, because I want to get more into applications, because I feel like there is a huge like clinical application still being more lenient, like you're talking about. And I know a lot of you guys' research has been kind of evolved around specifically neurological diseases, and I know that you have a huge like interest in that specific area. So maybe can you talk a little bit more about the applications, and we'll split it up, and we'll try to talk about like the aspect of like clinical stuff and like diseases, neurological conditions. Then we kind of get more into the body composition side of things, and maybe we can kind of split it up that way, because we have the people that have a problem, they have a health condition, and but when I was at ASPE, I was actually working with people on ketogenic diets that had cancer and things that really require, it could have been like, or it was like, at the point, like, a really good therapeutic method to be able to kind of like improve their symptoms. But then you have obviously a lot of the population that are just kind of going, it's like, oh, I want to like lose fat, I want to lose weight, and all kinds of stuff like that. So applications on the clinical setting, on the part of like, treating conditions or maybe helping the symptoms, what do we have on that side?
Yeah, so there you just touched on one's cancer. And there's a lot of work that's being done in that realm. And in combination, I think it's important to mention, it's in combination with standard of care. It's not, oh, the ketogenic diet's magical, it's going to cure people of cancer. That's not what we're saying. We're saying in combination with standard of care, it seems to be beneficial and mitigate a lot of the side effects of chemo and radiation, due to the fact that it's been shown over and over again, sugar feeds cancer cell growth. That's been documented. It's been shown that high amounts of carbohydrates, high amounts of insulin proliferate cancer cells to grow further. That's something that people just don't even think about. I talk with people all the time. One of the saddest things was my uncle had cancer, and immediately after he undergoes radiation and chemotherapy, he comes out and the nurse is walking around with soda, chips, crackers, and I'm like, you just put this guy through the ringer, and now we're gonna put gasoline into it and say, you know what, let's just feed what we just tried to kill. That's sad, but it's due to a lack of understanding. Yeah. So that's one aspect. You touch on some others. We're very big into neurological conditions. So Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, traumatic brain injury. A lot of them, the reason why a ketogenic diet and or even supplemental ketosis can be an option is because like Alzheimer's right now is being referred to as type 3 diabetes. They're calling it type 3 diabetes. The reason is we know with type 2 diabetes, our muscle cells are resistant to that signal. It doesn't matter. We have to pump out more and more insulin to try and get glucose into the cell. Alzheimer's is the same thing in the brain. We're trying to pump glucose across the blood-brain barrier, and it's becoming more and more resistant, and we're building up, due to a lack of energy, we're building up tau proteins, plaque, everything. What if you could provide an alternative source of energy? What if your goal wasn't to try and push glucose through? What if you still had the transport capacity for ketones? And you do in Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, traumatic brain injury. So we can dive into that, and that's a lot of our research focus right now. But some others, like there's research on depression, anxiety, schizophrenia. A lot of it due to the mood stabilizing effects of a ketogenic diet, right? So it's acting on certain neurotransmitters in the brain. So people who are struggling with some of those aspects and imbalances in neurotransmitters, having a higher fat diet helps balance out some of those neurotransmitters in the brain, and ketones themselves may assist with that. And then also just the anti-aging, longevity aspect of things. We've done research in animals. Obviously, we can't do it in humans, but in animals where you've literally given them a ketogenic diet their entire life and compared it to like a Western diet or even like a standard American Dietetic Association diet that would be higher protein, lower fat, moderate carb. And the ketogenic diet, animals tended to live longer and had healthier profiles as far as liver, kidney function, overall cardiovascular profile. So those would kind of be the main ones falling into that. There's even data on autism there's a couple of my colleagues right now that are looking at autism spectrum disorder. And again, a lot of that probably has to do with the brain-gut connection and the conversation that's happening there. So there's a lot of therapeutic applications.
Yeah, and literally each one of those conditions could have its own entire podcast, like to be talked about. So, but a lot of people listening to this also, and you know, like I said, these are the people that could benefit from this, like majorly, like, you know, in the clinical population. But obviously, most of the people on social media, that they're looking for this as a way to achieve their weight goals, whether it's weight loss, and we'll talk about muscle gain like briefly, but is there, like, I guess a question, because there are like, the people that are very supportive of this and the people that are very against it. Is it the way, or like, I guess, like, what's the research behind like body composition, so fat loss? And is a ketogenic diet like the way to actually drop fat, drop body fat, drop body weight? From that perspective, since most people actually that's what like they're here for.
Right, that's what most people want, right? And I'm glad you touched on that. And this is something you actually taught me, and I've seen you talk with a lot of clients about this. There's a million ways I can get you to lose weight, right? I could go to sleep tonight 186 pounds. I could wake up tomorrow 180. Does that mean I lost 6 pounds of fat? No, that's weight. There's a difference between weight and fat mass and muscle mass. Those are two parts of the weight equation, but there's a lot more to it. But people say they want to lose weight when they come to you and say that they want to lose fat. No one wants to lose muscle. I've yet to meet someone who's like, hey, I want to lose muscle. No, you want to lose fat mass. But to your point, yes, I think there's a lot of ways to achieve that. I don't think a ketogenic diet's the only way to lose fat mass. Studies show that people who are insulin sensitive, right? We all know those people. Sometimes we get mad at them because they're friends and family, but like they're the people that can eat 12 cookies, have a piece of cake, and then they wake up with veins on their abs, and they're like, man, that was great. And you're like, what? Those people are extremely insulin sensitive. Is there any reason, unless they're applying to one of the therapeutic applications, that they probably even need to entertain a ketogenic diet? No, they're extremely insulin sensitive. They can eat whatever the heck they want and be probably completely fine. Now, the majority of the population probably fall on the other end of the spectrum, the insulin resistant. And those are the people who look at the donut, walk past it, and then weigh 5 extra pounds. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Those are the people who easily put on weight, easily store fat. That's where most people fall. And studies show that people who are more insulin resistant don't respond as well to higher amounts of carbohydrates. So a lower carbohydrate, higher fat approach might be best for them. And the reason I say this, and there's a lot of, like you said, a lot of nonsense that's out there. It's not like the ketogenic diet's this magical cure-all, be-all. It's the only way to lose body fat. I've never said that. But the one thing I will say is that I think as a society today, we face a very big conundrum, and that conundrum is we live in a state where food controls us. I think so many people lose the liberty of being able to control when they snack, how they eat. Like, think about it. Like, we have food accessible to us all the time, right? Like, I can go into my cabinet right now, my pantry, and snack, and we can snack all the time. One of the greatest benefits that I've seen about people being in a state of ketosis, I feel like ketosis puts appetite back in your control. And even if it's not something you stay on for the rest of your life, I think it's something that everyone should experiment with if they're struggling on that aspect at some point, if they can get into a state of ketosis, to understand, if you do intermittent fasting, it makes it a lot easier. If you're eating 2 meals a day or even one meal a day, appetite's back in your control, and you realize the freedom and the liberty of, like, no, I'm back in control. I can walk past, and this used to never be me. I can walk past the candy aisle in the grocery store and not grab Mike and Ike's and Sweetest Fish and be like, oh, that doesn't even faze me anymore. Whereas before, it was automatic. Like, I walk into a grocery store, 2 boxes of Mike and Ike in my cart.
Yeah.
And I think so many people are stuck in that aspect. And I think that's where they're starting to see these changes is, wow, I'm able to control the amount of food I'm eating. I'm able to put in higher quality nutrients. I'm not snacking all the time. And that's a big piece in general for just overall body composition.
Yeah, no, and I agree. Because I feel like there's a lot of people that sometimes they don't have all the facts. And I was having a conversation with one of my colleagues. It's like, well, there's a lot of dietitians that are bashing ketogenic diets. And I'm like, I'm not going to sit in here and bash something that I don't have all the facts about. And I think that's one of, like, the bigger things. And we're going to get to, like, misconceptions and how do we deal with the people that are kind of going against it. But before we do that, like, I wanted to also ask you, like, again, as far as, some of, like, the benefits that we kind of experience, like, is a lot of the stuff with ketogenic diets, and I know, like, the clinical, like, benefits that we can kind of get from it, but a lot of, like, the people that go against ketogenic diets, they attribute the results or the things to the caloric restriction that sometimes it creates. Is it only the caloric restriction? And is there something else more that can actually be a part of this? Because I think a lot of people want to hear, like, your response on all this.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's the number one. I've had that conversation with a lot of people who aren't advocates of the ketogenic diet, and I kind of have 2 points on that. The first one is, if you do look at studies, there are studies that calorically match and match for protein. So I think that's another big one, is they go, oh, well, the ketogenic diet works better in research studies because they have higher amounts of protein. Certainly, there's a lot of studies where ketogenic diet has higher amount of protein. They see greater results, but they attribute it to the protein, not to the ketogenic diet. That's fine. There are studies that match for protein. There's a study, Young et al. We've done research. There's studies in CrossFit athletes that have literally eaten the same amount of calories and matched for protein intake and saw that a ketogenic diet was superior. Now, you can point to other studies that show that it's not as superior. That's fine. My caveat to that entire thing is, if it is a calorie equation, I think it's bigger than that. I think there's a metabolic difference between the two. But if you want to make the argument that it's just a calorie equation, my question is it necessarily a bad thing that if you look at studies where people selectively choose out a ketogenic diet, they eat less? At the end of the day, in the real world application, that's what matters. Like, I can put someone in a metabolic ward and feed them their meals. That's great. That's going to work well for 7 days. Now take people and put them into the real world when they don't have that food prepared for them. The Biggest Loser is a prime example. Look at how many people go on that show, go through extremes, wreck their metabolism, and then 6 months, let alone 6 years later, not only is it all gained back, they've gained probably more than they did when they started. Yep. And it's sad to see that because they've never instituted the principles. And it's cool. It's a temporary thing versus a long-term thing. If you're self-selecting calories on a ketogenic diet and you're by nature selecting out foods and you're eating a lower amount of calories, is that necessarily a bad thing? Cool. You can make the argument, oh, it's just calories. If you put 2 people and they're self-selecting their own calories and one's on a ketogenic diet and one's eating a higher amount of carbohydrates, and by nature they're selecting out a lower amount of calories, You could sit here and argue all the research you want. That's a win, because at the end of the day, that's what matters in the real world practical application. And I'd applaud that. I'd applaud that person for, cool, you're making changes and you're eating a lower amount of calories. So cool, great changes in your body composition.
No, that's true, man. And I think a lot of times, like, again, back to the misconceptions, and I think that exists a lot. Now let's talk about sustainability, because, you know, I think most, again, people talking about ketogenic diets, they fear that is this something that they can maintain. And I have done keto for an entire year, like, you know, very, like, you know, religiously. And I know you follow, like, a pretty strict, you know, ketogenic diet with some, like, you know, times that you kind of, like, cruises and things like that.
Sure.
Sometimes that kind of stuff happen. Yeah. But talk to me about sustainability, because I feel like a lot of people are like, nah, I don't think you can kind of maintain that.
Yeah, and I think this is a great point. And this is why I think it's more of a lifestyle intervention versus like having something where you're super rigid all the time. Like that kind of concept, no matter ketogenic diet, paleo diet, high carb, whatever it is, if it's something that's ridiculously rigid, people aren't going to sustain it for the rest of their lives. Regardless. The point is, what's the goal? Is your goal optimal health and human function, to lower your insulin load, to be in a ketogenic state in most of the day? If that's your goal, then you can be a lot more flexible. There are times where I have sushi. I probably have sushi twice a month. But like for me, I'm smart about it. I have it on days that I train legs. I do intermittent fasting and I incorporate it in. And I'm probably back in ketosis within hours afterwards. I don't check or track or let it consume my mind, but like I'm flexible with it. I like to maintain a degree of metabolic flexibility. I think people make it sustainable as long as they want to make it sustainable. Like I think there are two extremes. There are people who go to these extreme carb ups on the weekend because they feel like, oh my God, I think the minute people feel like they're getting something taken away from them is the minute they hold it, bottle it all up, and then it's like a huge explosion. Then they go on a cruise, they eat unlimited amounts, they come back from the cruise, they're like, screw it, I messed up, and then they eat like crap for a month, and then they're like, I knew it, I couldn't sustain it. No, it's how do you make things flexible? GB makes some of the most amazing recipes. I had a cake on my birthday that she made that literally I would take over any cake that I would get from anywhere else, and it was keto. And I'm like, it's all about creating options that are alternatives. You can make things. I've yet to find anything that I don't like, and I'm pretty picky with food. I've yet to find anything that's like, oh, well, I can't have that on keto. You just got to get creative and be something. And it doesn't even need to be, oh, that's keto. If it's lower carb, great. I don't need to have a high carb version of pasta. There's a bunch of options that are lower carb. Things like that is what ultimately dictates sustainability, I think, for anything.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty true statement. And I guess like a lot of people sometimes like talking about the aspect of like, you know, when you mention like sometimes like, oh, like people like they feel like there's something is taken away from them. So the restriction part, and then the kind of like the binge restrict cycle, we call that, and you know, when we're coaching clients. So the thing about it is, and again, a lot of like sometimes critics on ketogenic diets, they say that you're developing a fear of carbohydrates in people. So what is like sometimes the disconnect that could exist on that? Like for example, like I don't see you like, oh my God, like there's carbs. Of course, like when you're trying to follow a specific lifestyle, you're like, it's just not part of the way that I live. But I see some people sometimes like they either come to me or whatever, and like they are afraid, like they fear like this is poison. And what is like how did you kind of establish like, you know, like is it really, or how did you kind of like teach people like, hey, listen, it's just kind of part of the process, or what it may be?
Right, that's a really good point, because the last thing you ever want to do in anyone's life is create this disordered eating, right? Like I think that's a big thing as well, is, oh, this is going to create disordered eating concepts. I think that's one of the reasons why I think no one should ever, I mean, if they're really all in, they can do this, but like going from eating a standard American diet to eating keto is a big jump, like complete big jump. When you go from, my mom, for instance, who's implemented this, like when you go from eating pasta and bread and carbs all the time to completely jumping in, she's going to be craving bread and stuff. So like, how do you transition and go, all right, maybe if I'm eating standard American diet, how do I transition down to like a lower carb, maybe a paleo Mediterranean style, and then work my way to low carb, and then, oh, it's an easy jump from like paleo-ish to keto. You know, how do I work that transition? But you're right. The last thing you want to do is create this fear mongering of, oh, this is poison, stay away from this. It's understanding what's your goal? What's your outcome? Are you trying to fuel your body primarily running on fat and ketones? Are you trying to primarily fuel your body for performance running on carbohydrates or not running on fat and ketones? What is your goal? And I think for me, that's what it's always boiled down to. I look at nutrition now a little bit differently than I've looked at it before in the past. Before it was like, oh, this looks good, I'm going to eat it. Now I'm like, is this going to take me closer to my goals or take me further away? Is this something that's going to fuel me and get me what I'm trying to accomplish, or is it something that's going to take it away?
Yeah.
I know that I love eating hibachi and sushi.
I was going to tell you about that.
Yeah, I would go there all the time. And I do it on my birthday. But like, I know I feel like crap the day after just because it's a lot of fat and a lot of carbohydrates on top of that. But like, it's not something I would do weekly.
Yeah.
And it's not something that I'm not afraid of it. When I go home and I'm with my grandfather, I have a glass of wine and he would probably slap me if I didn't have a thing of bread or pasta with it. But like, those are all things I plan for. It's not something that's needed to be fearful of. It's just understanding the context and what your goals and outcomes are.
Now, is there room for, I know people talk about cycling or like they say, for example, would you go a specific amount of time because of like the benefits on insulin sensitivity and things like that to, for example, when you're looking, because I teach a lot of people about nutrition periodization and basically understanding how the year, you're not supposed to be like in a fat loss stage all year long, 12 months a year, 365 days of the year. So is there room for example, saying, well, you're gonna do keto for maybe 6 months and then kind of like going back to normal, kind of like starting standard eating, not standard American diet, because that's the problem that exists right now. I feel like people go into extremes and they say, you know what, I'm gonna go now to eat crap again because I'm not doing keto anymore. No, it's just going from like wholesome type of like, balanced type of diet to now going to more ketogenic diet type of approach. Is there room for that? Is there research behind it? Is there kind of like a way for that to kind of like, exist in harmony?
Absolutely. And there's actually research on this. And this is the approach I do. Like, there are points throughout the year, like if I'm starting to be like, oh, I'm starting to get a little chubby, where I might dial it in a little bit more, right? Like I might be a little bit more strict. I might do like a little bit longer intermittent fasting, only have 1 to 2 meals. There are times where I do that. Most of my year is completely flexible and falls into a middle state, where there's a study by Paoli where he basically took individuals, put them on a ketogenic diet, and he did it for a month. And then he transitioned them for a month to like a low carb diet, and then he transitioned them for like 2 weeks to Mediterranean, and then cycled that back. Oh. And he basically saw that they continued to lose. Like it wasn't like a linear thing, but it was like they continued to lose. Whereas likely if they were to stay on one of those things, they probably would plateau out. But like, how do you continue making progress? He was cycling them similar to what your approach is from hardcore keto to like a lower carb approach to Mediterranean and then back in. It was never like keto, which I would never recommend. It was never keto to a Western diet. That's the worst thing you could probably do, is ever go like hardcore on one end all the way up to high fat, high carb again. Definitely don't want to do that. But going from like keto down to low carb to Mediterranean and cycling that, he saw great results in his individuals. If you look anywhere on social media, you're probably getting bombarded with ads on these pills that they say pills, keto weight loss, blah, blah, and they're just nonsense claims. Oh, featured on Shark Tank, all that's nonsense. We did a whole video breaking that down and how there's some organization behind it that is creating all these different products that are just little ketone, like 100 milligrams, which is nothing, inside of a pill, and making all these false claims, and people are getting scammed out of it, which is sad to see. But that's the sad part, is because I think there is an application. I think there is a world where exogenous ketones can have a tremendous impact.
Well, I've seen it, like at ASPE, when, like the stuff you did with like, Parkinson's patients and people like that as well, like, by just simple application, like, acutely one time.
Exactly. And that's where I think the application should be. Like, I think so many people are seeing benefits for like cognitive function, focus, where they might not otherwise. And a lot of it's due to probably there's some form of insulin resistance in the brain. You're providing a fuel source for the brain that it's never been really exposed to before. And you have this fuel source now that you can drink versus trying to take through the adaptation period. Not that it's meant to replace that and you're going to get all the same benefits, but that it's a quick, immediate fuel source. We've done studies in Parkinson's patients where you literally have people who are shaking and have neurological dysfunction. They're all over the map. And within 30 minutes, stop shaking and their alertness is up. Like, what's the power in that? Like, that is energy to their brain that they otherwise wouldn't have had. We're doing research right now with NFL athletes, former NFL athletes. We have a guy that we're working with. It's terrible to see, but he literally has to wear one of those things on his neck because if he goes out of his home without anyone, he has no idea how to get home because that's how much brain damage he has. You look at a brain of someone who has traumatic brain injury versus someone who has Alzheimer's, and a lot of times they look exactly the same. There's so much disruption there, impaired glucose metabolism. What if you were able to provide a source of fuel for the brain that it actually can utilize? So one of the applications I think there's an enormous potential, and I'm hopeful that this happens one day, is one day on the sidelines instead of going over, and even if it's in conjunction with, but at most having exogenous ketones on the sideline for athletes to have, because you're getting trauma to your brain, whether you take a big hit or you're a lineman. And studies have shown over and over again that little micro impact makes your brain temporarily insulin resistant. And what do? They go over to the sideline, they chug a bunch of sugar water, and they're having all this stuff. Well, their brain can't take it up and utilize it. So how does that compound from the time they're 10 years old when they start playing to the time they're 30 when they're in the league? And we're wondering why all these athletes are having CTE or acting crazy. Some of them are just crazy, but like having all these crazy things, they're messed up. Their brain is got so much disruption going on. What if it could be partially helped or assisted with a different fuel source?
Yeah, and I think when you mentioned the word conjunction, because I think I have one of my clients who also is an endurance athlete, and he actually runs Ironmans. And he actually took like a ketone ester one time. Wow. But which, it's a pretty strong taste.
Yeah.
But he mentioned and he was actually consuming carbohydrates and all kinds of stuff like that. But he noticed an improvement because he does a lot of data tracking, and he noticed an improvement in performance because I feel like you said the key word, it's a fuel source. Because a lot of people sometimes misconstrued the benefits because again of the marketing and some the companies that I feel like are putting a bad taste in people's mouth as far as what keto is, right? Because of the way that they're just trying to sell. They're trying to make sure that their product gets into the market and competing in a very saturated place right now, which is obviously the ketogenic space, and they're gonna do anything they can to be able to kind of push it through. And weight loss is gonna be the fastest thing that they will do. Right. So I think but talking more specifically on conjunction. So did you see that being part of as you're saying doing both, or maybe application of both in a way that can actually maybe enhance or improve performance as part of that?
For sure. And I call it this concept of dual fuel. Imagine before, if you just had carbohydrates, because endurance athletes do it all the time. They have the goos and the gels to try and keep them going, really to maintain glycogen levels. What if you have the ability to have two fuel sources versus one? It's the reason why a lot of endurance athletes use different types of carbohydrates to use different transporters to try and get that. What if now you have a completely different fuel that's able to spare glycogen, provide a fuel source for the brain, and potentially have performance improvements, and you have that with carbohydrates as well if you're an endurance athlete? For sure. I think there's a lot of data really with the ketone ester, because that's where it started. But I think we're starting to see, there was just a recent study published by Dr. Jeff Volek using the ketone salts, seeing an improvement in cyclists. So
in conjunction, you're saying?
Or? It was individuals who were not on a ketogenic diet, just using ketone salts. So they were carb adapted, but they had the ketone salts and saw an improvement.
Wow, that's crazy. Awesome, man. So I have only a couple more questions before we wrap it up. But the first thing is how did you combat the critics, or how did you go about obviously not necessarily critiquing or I'm not gonna call them the haters, but the people that sometimes unfounded or founded, whatever may be the case, these misconceptions that sometimes exist around the ketogenic diet. How did you kind of not battle them, but how did you kind of respond to them, and kind of how did you go about it? Because that's a big part of the conversation that a lot of people listening in, they want to know this.
For sure. Younger me, even though I'm still young, but younger me was a lot more aggressive. So younger me would want to take oh, anyone that comes out, people call it, like when we first started doing ketogenic diet research, we were thrown under the, people were like, these guys suck, this is terrible, blah, blah, blah. Now everyone's like, oh, wow, maybe they actually had something legitimate. But like younger me would have been, I'm going to combat you, come here, I'm going to like talk to me, I'm going to answer every single thing. As I've matured, I've realized, you know what, you're never going to please everyone. Like the only thing I can do is just educate louder and educate the right way and make sure, like if I can look myself in the mirror at night and go, I'm doing the best I can, and I focus on offense, right? Like a lot of people are just so concerned about playing defense that I'm like, you know what, when that Jillian Michaels story broke, where Jillian Michaels ripped apart keto and she did that whole thing, everyone's like, make an entire video, go after her, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, I could do that. But like the minute I do that, I'm taking away from maybe making more content or educating or doing research that could help these 100 people versus like you 4 that want me to make this video combating Jillian Michaels. What good does that do us? I'd rather, I feel bad. I feel bad because I didn't get to the people who she got to earlier. So like that just fuels me to go educate further faster. It's the same thing why we made that video on the ketone pills, because like there are so many people, and I feel devastated every time I see that people are like, oh my God, I just bought these yesterday, and they're like 50, 60, 70 bucks. And for some people that's a lot of money. Yeah. And like I just feel bad that I wasn't able to get to them earlier. So for me it's more of an offensive play versus like trying to defend and trying to talk to some of those critics or people who are
just staying silent and do your thing. And I think that's a bigger thing, because you're always going to have people are going to go against your methods, or are going to get against like even the research like you have to putting out. So I think that's a bigger part. Always. Just to finish up, we like to do what we call, well, I guess like the last question would be, what is the future of keto? Like, what do you think is, like if you look at 10 years on the road, 20 years on the road, what do you see? Not just yourself, but just kind of like the ketogenic diets, where you see that standing at that point.
Yeah, I still think it's going to continue to grow as long as the conversation gets protected the right way and disseminated the right way, right? Like if we're coming out saying, hey, just remove the bun from burgers and that's the way to do keto all the time, it's gonna turn into a fad and people are going to fall off of it. I think if we keep educating the right way and doing the research the right way and finding out some of these therapeutic applications, I think it will continue to grow. I'm excited to see it grow inside of mainstream medical. I'm excited to see a lot more doctors, dietitians who are more open to it, where when they heard keto, the only thing they thought of was ketoacidosis and were like, oh, this is terrible. Yeah. And they were misconstruing uncontrolled type 1 diabetes with like an actual ketogenic state. Very, very different, but I'm excited to see it grow in those areas. Like the body composition is great. I'm excited to see like the neurological aspects, the rate of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, traumatic brain injury that we're facing and will continue to face as the baby boomers continue to get older is alarming. And I just, at the end of the day, I like that it's bringing more attention to, one, eating whole foods, bringing fat back into the diet, and minimizing processed carbohydrates. I don't think anyone would argue with those 3 concepts, especially talk about the neurological aspects about the baby boomers and everything. But the thing that's even scarier than that is we have an alarming rate of childhood obesity. And that's not from eating avocados. That's from eating gummy bears, this, that. And like, not that kids should be on, like, I'm not saying every kid needs to be on a ketogenic diet, just bringing whole foods back to the plate and bringing in healthy fats, minimizing those processed carbohydrates. If it's bringing light to that, I love that, and hopefully we can help institute changes.
Yeah, and with the right education, I think is like the bigger thing, which is what we both try to do. So right, man. That's awesome. Well, the last thing would be rapid fire questions. Is a thing that we do at Vegan Nutrition Radio. So it'll be just 4 simple questions, and then you just need to
rapid
shoot the
fire.
First thing. Yeah, we'll do it that way. Deal. So first one would be favorite exercise.
Squats.
Okay, that's a good one. Second one would be, what's a book that everybody should have on their bookshelf? Like, think about it today that you would gift to somebody.
How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Okay, nice. That's a good one. This third one would be, what's a podcast or YouTube channel or something that, people should definitely go and check out and listen to, and you can definitely plug in the What the Fat podcast, which is awesome.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously I love what you do. In all seriousness, I think.
Thank you.
I think bringing constant light to nutrition. I think anything I don't listen to as many podcasts as I probably should, but
Yeah,
like
me either.
I think anything that's going to inspire you to take action, if you find someone who's legitimate that puts out good quality content that's going to inspire you to take action, I love it. I'm all for it.
Awesome. Last question would be, if you were stranded on a desert island for the rest of your life and you were to choose only one food to have for the rest of existence while you're there, what would that be?
I get asked this question a lot, right?
Really?
I do. And like my younger side of me says like cake and cookies, but like the analytical side of me probably says more like avocado, because I'm like, I can sustain and thrive off of something like that. And I love I love them as it is, but like the cake or the cookies is easy, but like I'd probably die within a month eating just that. But it'd probably be like avocados.
That's good. Well, you have it on your shirt, so if you could choose a second one, would probably be bacon. So
Probably be
a couple of
bacon.
things like that too. Now it's funny, but I was actually talking to somebody, like there's the analytical brain of like when I bring people on the podcast that are like either researchers or like dietitians or stuff, like they're gonna go to like, well, the reasoning why this is actually gonna help me sustain like everything. So that's awesome. How can people find you, dude? Like, how can people reach out to you, talk to you, find out more about you?
Social media, I mean, Ryan Plowry. People still think my last name is Plowry. I get that all the time. It's Patrick Lowry, so it's just at Ryan P. Lowry, Dr. Ryan Lowry. Anything, if anyone's interested in keto, we have ketogenic.com and ketogenic.com. But yeah, I mean, and What the Fat podcast, we talk about some stuff. We got to get you on there ASAP, and just talk about lifestyle stuff, talk about positivity, making life better, and just changing people's lives from different perspectives.
Awesome, man. Well, you heard from the man himself. Make sure to you check out the links in the show notes so you can actually go and check out Ryan's Instagram pages. Definitely ketogenic.com is a great resource for people that are starting on a ketogenic diet. Like, the first thing you need to understand with keto is that you have to educate yourself well. And of course, if you can get a chance to hire somebody like a coach or a nutrition, educator, a dietitian that can help you get to your journey and do it the right way, obviously we recommend that. Thank you guys so much for listening on VV Nutrition Radio on another episode. Ryan, thank you so much for having me, man.
Thanks, brother.